All right, we are back. This is Dr. Jenkins, and today we're talking about the endocrine system. It's going to be all about the hormones. All right, so just like the previous chapter, this is kind of thrown in there. But if we think back, not too long ago, we did the nervous system. So the nervous system and the endocrine systems, these are the two body systems that regulate and control our body. Everybody thinks of the nervous system as overseeing the body. Maybe I'll put body organs. Maybe that'll be better. Everyone thinks of the nervous system because we have the brain, and the brain sends out nerve impulses to tell the organs what to do. But equally as important in regulating our body is the endocrine system. So over and over and over again, the two body systems that regulate our body are the nervous and the endocrine. Whereas the nervous system communicated through nerve impulses, the endocrine system communicates through hormones. So same overall goal of regulating and overseeing the body. They just do it a little differently. This is kind of a funny cartoon. Because one of the things that the endocrine system does is it helps our body handle stress, whether it's a big acute stress like you got a rock or boulder over you, you're about to die, or whether it's more of a smaller stress like exercise, which can actually be good, but still it's a stress to the body. All right, the beginning part of the chapter, we're going to talk about the structure and function of this system. And then the second part is really kind of dry because we're just going to list the glands and the hormones they produce and their function. So that part is really just going to be memorization for you. But let's start with the structure and function. All right, I've already introduced this. What are the two body systems that regulate our organs? The nervous and the endocrine. And of course, in regulating our body systems, they're helping us to maintain homeostasis because that's the goal. So we know the function is to help regulate the body systems and maintain homeostasis. We know that the endocrine system works with the nervous system. What is the endocrine system made up of? Well, it's made up of three basic parts. First of all, we have the glands: pituitary gland, adrenal gland, hypothalamus, thymus gland. There's all sorts of glands, the testes and ovaries in men and women respectively. These glands release hormones. The hormones are the chemical messengers that deliver a message all across the body. And then whatever target cell that hormone acts at, well, that's part of the endocrine system too. So we just simplify it by saying the glands are there, they release the hormones. Where the hormones travel to is the target cell. Pretty much every place in the body ends up being a target cell because our hormones, they go pretty much everywhere. If we use the example of growth hormone, that's a pretty easy hormone for people to understand, that is produced in the pituitary gland, which we'll talk about. It's up in the brain. The hormone that is released is growth hormone. What are the target cells of growth hormone? Where does growth hormone go? Muscles and bones. And it tells the muscles and bones to grow, hence the name growth hormone. All right. Just took a little drink there, excuse me. When you talk all day for a living, you have to keep hydrated. So again, we know that the two body systems that regulate our organs, nervous and endocrine. Now that we've done the nervous system already, I think it's a nice opportunity for us to do a compare and contrast. Look at this. I've put in red, and it's kind of a beige color. It's kind of a boring color. I've put in color what I would like you to know. Here are the differences. Now, of course, the similarity is that both of these systems work to regulate the body. So the function is pretty much the same, but how they do it is different. The nervous system sends nerve impulses, whereas the endocrine system communicates through hormones. Nerve impulses tend to have localized effect. A nerve impulse, that tail, that axon, only goes to a specific spot, whereas hormones can have more widespread effects. Think about growth hormone. It isn't just that there is only one growth hormone that goes to one part of one muscle. Instead, we have a lot of growth hormone, and all at once, it goes to a lot of bones and muscles. The nervous system works quickly. A nerve impulse, that electrical current is quick, versus hormones take longer. We've got to wait for those hormones to be sent through the bloodstream. And the nervous system, it has a quick response, but that response, even though it's really quick, it's short-lasting. Whereas hormones, even though they take a little bit longer to get to their target cell, their responses tend to last longer. For example, a nerve impulse going into a muscle will cause one contraction and that's it. One nerve impulse equals one muscle contraction, like a twitch, and you're done. It's fast, it's quick, doesn't last very long. Hormones, it may take longer, it does take longer to get growth hormone to the muscles. But once they do get to the muscles, the effect is much longer. 8 hours plus. So make sure you review, and this might mean you have to go back to the nervous system a little bit, I suppose. I'm hoping that you remember all these things, but all right, a good compare and contrast. Love it. Here's a way to see it visually. So a nerve impulse, we know the nerve impulse is going to come from the brain. I'm going to try and draw a brain here. Oh, it's a terrible brain. Oh, still a terrible brain. So a nerve impulse, the instructions to give the nerve impulse come from the brain. Nerve impulse goes down the axon to a localized area, right? Versus hormones. Hormones are the little green dots here. I'll do it in yellow just so we can see. These little green dots are the hormones. They're released from a gland. So we have a gland. Releases the hormones. But the hormones have to travel through the bloodstream. And therefore it takes longer. And when it gets to a target area, it has an effect that is much more widespread. Because the capillary bed spreads really wide over an area. Okay, when we're talking about glands, so we're going to talk about the structure, and we're starting with glands. These are the organs that produce and release hormones. There are two types. There are endocrine glands. These are the most common. This is what you think of. This is the pituitary gland. This is the thyroid gland. This is the testes and ovary. That's a little trickier. Let's stick with these. Let's stick with the adrenal, for example. Most of our glands are considered to be endocrine. And what that means is when a gland releases its hormone, let's look at this is the thymus gland. Well, let's go to the thyroid. The thyroid's in the neck. The thyroid gland is going to release thyroid hormone. It's going to release calcitonin. Those hormones go right into the blood. Boom. Nice and easy. So endocrine glands secrete their hormones directly into the blood. An exocrine gland, which is less common, secretes their hormones into a duct. And we're going to see an example of this in a little bit. And the example here is the pancreas. what we're going to find, let me enlarge this. What we're going to find is the pancreas is this organ, right? The pancreas will produce hormones, the blue dots, but the blue dots have to travel down a duct. There's a duct that runs right down the center of the pancreas. So instead of releasing its hormones directly into the blood, the pancreas will release its hormones into a duct. That duct will eventually get into the blood, but it goes through a duct first. I may have made that more complicated than it needs to be. Endocrine glands are most common. Hormones are secreted directly into the blood. An exocrine gland is less common. Our example is the pancreas, and it will secrete its hormones into a duct. That duct will eventually lead to the bloodstream. Here are the glands. Hypothalamus is up in the brain, pituitary up in the brain. We have some in the throat like the thyroid, some right above the heart like the thymus, some on top of the kidneys like the adrenal. The pancreas is a gland, the gonads down below. So this is a little unique. Other body systems we'll talk about tend to have organs that are more closely together. Think about the cardiovascular system. You have the heart and the lungs right there, right? The digestive system. The esophagus leads right into the stomach, which leads into the small intestine, leads into the large intestine. But the endocrine glands are a little unique in that they're scattered around. Okay, so we talked about glands, endocrine versus exocrine. Let's now talk about hormones. We're going to talk about two different types of hormones. There are a couple more, but we're going to try and be as basic as we can. The most common hormone is a peptide hormone. Examples of peptide hormones are growth hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, blah, 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 blah. So most hormones are peptide hormones, and they're made up of proteins. As a matter of fact, the amino acids that make up proteins are bound together by peptide bonds. So the word peptide immediately makes us think of proteins. Then there's another category of steroid hormones. And these are, for the most part, the sex hormones. Estrogen, progesterone, how did I forget testosterone? So they are completely different in structure, right? The sex hormones have more of a fatty makeup to them. They're cholesterol derivatives. So they're just different in structure. And then if that affects how they travel in the bloodstream, that impacts how they get into the target cell. Okay, I am leading myself into what I just said. So if we talk about the peptide versus the steroid hormones, right? Remember, peptide made up of proteins, most common. Steroid or sex hormones are made up more of a lipid substance. They respond differently. They are transported in the blood differently, and they enter the target differently. Ooh, this should be or. I got a typo. I apologize. Basically, what it comes down to is whether a hormone is lipid-soluble or water-soluble. Our water-soluble hormones are our peptide hormones. Our lipid-soluble hormones are our steroid hormones. So if I went back, I could say peptide hormones are water-soluble. They can dissolve in the bloodstream. The steroid hormones are lipid-soluble. They're able to dissolve through a lipid membrane, but they're not able to dissolve in water. Right? Peptide hormones are water-soluble. This means that they can dissolve in the bloodstream. They're water soluble. They can dissolve in the bloodstream, which is mostly water. Steroid hormones cannot dissolve in water. Therefore, when they travel the bloodstream, they require a carrier. So I suppose one could look at this and conclude that, well, because peptide hormones are water soluble and they can dissolve in the blood, the peptide hormones are easier to transport in the blood. You could make that argument. Because they can dissolve right in the plasma of the blood, which is water, they transport themselves in the blood pretty easily. Versus the steroid hormones, which cannot dissolve in the bloodstream, require a carrier. So it's a little bit extra work. So it's more difficult to get the steroid hormones circulating in the bloodstream. On the other hand, in terms of how they enter the target cell, the steroid hormones can enter the target cell directly. So it's almost easier. Because they're lipid soluble and the cell membrane is made up of lipid, even though the steroid hormones have to have a carrier in the bloodstream to be transported, once they get to the target, they can scoot right through the cell membrane. Easy peasy. Versus the water soluble. While they can dissolve in the blood and be transported easily, once they get to the target cell, they can't enter it directly. So there has to be a couple of intermediate steps to get it into the cell. It'll get into the cell, it's just a little bit harder. You should know these differences. Here is a more visual way of saying the same thing. Our peptide hormones can dissolve in the blood. Look at the blue triangle. Dissolve in the blood on its own. However, once we take that water-soluble peptide hormone out of the bloodstream, it can't go directly into the target cell. So it has to kind of interact with the membrane on the surface, and then through a series of reactions, then eventually it'll get inside. On the other hand, let's see, what color can I use? Let's use green. The lipid-soluble hormones, they need a carrier. See how this blue triangle needs a little green rectangle. So it needs a carrier in the bloodstream, but once it gets out of the bloodstream, it can go directly into the cell. Cool. Look at all your learning, right? This is saying the same thing. It's just saying it in words. I don't even need to repeat it. Okay. Those peptide hormones, remember we said that the peptide hormones travel freely in the bloodstream because they can dissolve, but once they get to the target cell, they have to bind to a receptor, and then there's a bunch of chemical reactions before it can actually get inside the cell. You don't have to know all these chemical reactions, but I just want to give you an idea. So here we had a peptide hormone leaving the bloodstream. It will have to bind to a receptor in the cell membrane surface. And then the binding of that leads to this chemical reaction, which leads to this chemical reaction, which leads to this chemical reaction, which eventually leads to this and then this. So without getting all detailed, all we see is in order to have that effect inside the cell, it's got to go through a bunch of chemical reactions. Okay. Now before we get to going through the glands and hormones themselves, we have one last thing to discuss. Once that hormone gets to a target cell, what does it do? Yeah, we know a hormone is a chemical messenger, but when growth hormone gets to a muscle, how is it that that growth hormone actually tells the muscle to grow? And it's not like, I've been saying that a hormone is like a chemical messenger. It is, but it's not like hormones aren't chemical messengers that leave a long, detailed voicemail, right? Instead, it's very simple. It's a really simple message. Basically, when that hormone gets into a target cell, it either speeds up what the cell is already doing. Let's call that green. Speeds up. So if it goes to an enzyme in the muscle cell, it makes those enzymes work harder. So it's almost like giving a green light. So sometimes a chemical messenger delivers a message that basically says go, and it makes the cell do more, or a part of the cell do more of what it already does. On the other hand, we could get one that tells the cell to slow down, and that would be like giving it the red light. I give you an example down below. When growth hormone goes to a muscle, it actually activates enzymes in the muscle to do more repair and growth. So it's telling the enzymes to do more. Repair, grow more, green light. In other instances, when a hormone gets to a cell, it tells the cell, slow down, do less. And that's really it, folks. Isn't that great? Green light, red light. Okay. We're going to be a little bit boring here, but there's really no way of getting around it. We're going to list some glands and some hormones and their functions. We're going to start most superior with the hypothalamus. For each, you're going to have to know the gland, where it's located, the gland, where it's located, the hormones that are produced, and the effect of those hormones on the target cell. I am not going to be asking you to know every hormone. You're only going to have to know the ones that are starred. Let's start with the hypothalamus. You should know this one. The hypothalamus is in the brain. If we look closely, the hypothalamus is this region of the brain. And it is kind of like a region. It's not very satisfying. Just like a blob, a region. But it's really important. I want to point out a couple things. Hanging down from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. So this blue thing is the pituitary gland, which we're going to discuss next. So one function of the hypothalamus overall oversees the pituitary gland. So because the pituitary gland dangles down from the hypothalamus is largely overseeing the pituitary gland. What specific hormones are released from the hypothalamus? ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. Now, truth be told, up here is the hypothalamus, okay? And then down here is the pituitary gland, because it hangs down from it. So, to be fair, ADH is produced in the hypothalamus. But that ADH actually travels down to the posterior pituitary gland, and it's actually released from the posterior pituitary. I'm not going to have you know that specific difference, but for the sake of being anatomically correct, I want to make sure that I point that out. So the ADH is produced in the hypothalamus. It is actually released from the posterior pituitary, but it's produced in the hypothalamus. ADH is our water-retaining hormone. ADH, having some water here. ADH goes to the kidneys, and it tells the kidneys to retain more water. Think about it. A diuretic makes you pee more. A diuretic makes you pee out and lose water. So an anti-diuretic, instead of peeing out and losing water for a diuretic, an anti-diuretic does the opposite. It tells your kidneys to hold on to water. Water-retaining hormone. Target tissue, target cell are those in the kidneys. The hypothalamus also produces oxytocin, which is really important during childbirth for women, but you do not have to know that. Hanging down from the hypothalamus is up here. Hanging down from it is an anterior and a posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is anterior on the front, and the posterior pituitary gland is posterior on the back. The posterior pituitary gland doesn't produce any hormones itself. The only job of the posterior pituitary gland is to release the hormones that were produced in the hypothalamus. So we did talk about, for example, anti-diuretic hormone produced in the hypothalamus travels down to the posterior pituitary gland. So the posterior pituitary gland doesn't produce any hormones itself, but it does help to release some from the hypothalamus. However, the anterior pituitary gland produces and secretes the most hormones out of any gland. Thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, melanocyte stimulating hormone, growth hormone. It's a lot. Out of all of these, the only one I'm asking you is growth hormone. I'm being nice, look at me. So, growth hormone is produced in the anterior pituitary gland and is released from the anterior pituitary gland. What does it do? Causes growth. What are the target cells? Muscles and bones. So I want to make a point here. Many of these anterior pituitary hormones actually travel to other glands and tell those glands to release hormones. Do I have a picture? Let me go back to the picture of all of them. So it's pretty interesting. Let's see, what color can I use? Really bright green. So for example, and you don't have to know this, I'm just giving you an example. In the anterior pituitary gland, we release a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. It is released from the anterior pituitary gland into the bloodstream. It's pumped out by the heart, travels all the way down to the testes in males and the ovaries in females. And it will trigger the ovaries and testes to produce other hormones. So sometimes the release of one hormone goes to an organ and tells that organ to release another hormone. So it can have effects upon each other. All right, that was the hypothalamus and pituitary gland up in the brain. Now we're moving more inferior, and we get to the gland that surrounds our trachea, called the thyroid. Now be careful because we have the thyroid and the thymus, so just make sure that you study both more specifically. The thyroid is higher, right around your trachea. One hormone that is released from the thyroid gland is the thyroid hormone. And one of the functions of the thyroid hormone is to boost metabolism. Maybe you've heard of people who have hyper or hypoactive thyroid glands, hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism. This can mess with their metabolic rate. Someone who has hypothyroidism, their metabolic rate is slower than the average person, and therefore they're more likely to gain weight. Okay, keep it simple. There are other hormones. I'm only asking you to know some of them. Let's see. I haven't even talked about, yes. So I'm just going to go to this slide right away. Let's talk about iodine really quickly. Iodine is needed for your thyroid gland to properly function. So if I want my thyroid gland to do what it's supposed to do, I need iodine. Iodine does come in seafood and some vegetables, but in the US, we get most of our iodine from salt. It's iodized salt. This salt supplies iodine, a necessary nutrient. A goiter is what can happen if you don't have enough iodine and the thyroid gland cannot function properly. Simply put, the thyroid gland starts to become overactive and it actually swells because it's trying so hard to work. It just doesn't have all the tools that it needs. You don't need to know these. They're not read, just extra information. On the back of the thyroid gland are 4 small little nodules. I'm going to put them in yellow, called the parathyroid gland. On the back of the thyroid gland are 4 little small nodules, collectively known as the parathyroid gland. These little small nodules, these glands, produce parathyroid hormone. I mean, it couldn't be much easier than that, could it? Parathyroid releases parathyroid hormone. Thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone. But the function is different. The function of the parathyroid hormone is to help regulate blood calcium. Just memorization, folks. Okay, so we talked about the brain. We talked about the thyroid. I think I even skipped the thymus. Yeah. So I skipped the thymus gland completely because of time. So we're going to skip all the way down to the kidneys. On top of the kidneys are the adrenal glands. The kidneys themselves are right here. They're kind of cute, look little kidney beans. Well, sitting on top of each kidney is an adrenal gland. Cool. If we look inside the adrenal gland, it has 2 parts, 2 functional parts. The adrenal cortex is the outer region, and the adrenal medulla is the inner region, which is purple. The outer region will produce and release one set of hormones. The inner region will produce and release another set of hormones. Now, both parts of the adrenal glands play a role in our body's response to stress. Okay? Both portions of the adrenal glands play a role in our body's response to stress. The adrenal medulla, the inner part, these hormones are responsible for our short-term response to stress. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are our fight-or-flight hormones. What's also cool is that epinephrine and norepinephrine can also function as neurotransmitters, which cross the gap between synapses, between nerves. But they do function as hormones also. So they help with our short-term response to stress. The adrenal cortex, the outer region, one example of a hormone it releases is called cortisol. And cortisol is our body's natural anti-inflammatory. And in a way of speaking, cortisol helps with our long-term response to stress. Cortisol, when it's released, doesn't have an effect immediately, but when we've had extreme stress over time, cortisol is there to help you recover. Short-term response to stress, adrenal medulla, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Adrenal cortex, long-term response to stress, cortisol. Here you go. We can see the adrenal medulla releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. Let me get the red, yellow. Epinephrine and norepinephrine for our body's short-term response to stress. Whereas the what's called glucocorticoids, but also cortisol. Cortisol from our adrenal cortex. I remember C and C, adrenal cortex releases cortisol. This is our body's long-term response to stress. Oh, the pancreas. The pancreas is a digestive organ, which we will discuss later because it does produce digestive enzymes. But the pancreas is also a gland, because it releases insulin and glucagon. These two hormones help to regulate blood sugar. I'm sure you've heard of these. Here's a better look at the duct running down the center of the pancreas, because remember, the pancreas was our one example of an exocrine gland, where hormones are produced and then they have to travel to the duct, and then those hormones will travel down the duct, eventually into the blood. So insulin and glucagon together help our body to regulate blood sugar. Make sure you know which is which. When blood sugar is high, insulin is released, which tells our liver to store glucose away as glycogen. So the target organ here is the liver, whereas glucagon is released when blood glucose is low. And this causes our liver to release glucose stores. Good stuff. This is an example of a negative feedback loop. Remember we said at the beginning that the endocrine system helps to regulate our body organs and maintain homeostasis? So whenever there is a change from normal, your body senses that, may release a hormone, which tells the body to do something to bring it back to normal. Negative feedback. If blood sugar is too high, which is the case up top, if you ate a whole bunch of pixie sticks, your blood sugar would be really high. Which hormone is released when blood sugar is high? Insulin. Tells the liver to take glucose out of the blood to store it as glycogen. On the other hand, if glucose is abnormally low, your body's going to sense that, and it's going to release glucagon, which tells your liver to release some of its glycogen stores as glucose. Good stuff. When we talk about insulin and glucagon, we have to talk about diabetes. Diabetes is the disease condition when your body is no longer able to control blood sugar regulation. There are two main types, type 1 and type 2. Make sure you know these. Type 2 is what you think of. Type 2 is usually more likely to occur when you're an adult, later in life. It's more likely to occur in sedentary individuals with a family history of cardiovascular disease, those who don't eat well. In type 2, there may be insulin. The body isn't responsive to it. So there may be insulin there, but it's just that the tissues are not responsive to it. They've been exposed to so much insulin that finally they're just resistant. Type 1 is more of the type that's genetic, more likely to see in kids. And in type 1 diabetes, you just don't have enough insulin. Last thing would be the testes and the ovaries. These are our steroid hormones, right? This is a really funny cartoon. I take it you haven't had sex for a while. What do I have on the next screen? Okay, cool. So for our testes, they are going to produce mostly testosterone, which will stimulate growth of the penis and the testes and promote male sex characteristics like a deepening of the voice, more hair on the body, more muscular growth. But this happens to be one of those hormones that has to be stimulated first by a pituitary hormone. You don't have to know that, but I'm just reminding you if you're interested. Don't forget, the testes do produce a small amount of estrogen. It's just that in males, the testes will produce much, much, much more testosterone. And then the ovaries, this is also our steroid sex hormone for the women. It is the ovaries. They produce estrogen and progesterone. Together, they regulate the menstrual cycle, and they stimulate the growth of the vagina and uterus. Women also have a small amount of testosterone, but of course they have much more estrogen and progesterone. Not so bad, folks. Let's do a good job this week, and I'll see you later.